Welcome to Facebook Live. This is an opportunity that I have to periodically communicate and give you a chance to learn what's going on in Washington on timely issues. And through the chat box, ask questions, and we will try to keep this as a free flowing discussion. In previous Facebook Lives, we've talked about the direct impact of COVID-19 on health, on our healthcare system, as well as on our economic system. Today, we're going to talk about the impact it has on our election process. And I am so pleased to have two outstanding experts with us today that have been in the forefront of fighting for our democratic principles. Kristen Clarke, who is on the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law and has been there for a long time fighting on behalf of civil rights. And Dana Vickers Shelley from the ACLU Maryland chapter, who's been in the forefront of protecting our civil liberties. I just want to start with an observation. Free and fair elections are the cornerstone of our democracy. It's the bedrock in which we base all of our democratic principles on a representative government that truly represents the will of the people. If you don't have free and fair elections, you don't have a democracy. And prior to COVID-19, we've seen challenges in this country in regards to our election process. We have a federalism system, which means our election laws are basically run and created by our states. And therefore, there's a different way of conducting elections in each one of our 50 states around this nation. And we've seen challenges. We've seen voter intimidation. We've seen restrictions on those who are eligible to vote. We've seen direct misinformation given out in regards to voting in this country. So we've had a challenge for some time prior to COVID-19, and we need to do things about it. I filed several bills, including the Democracy Restoration Act that would allow returning citizens the right to vote. We do that in federal elections because that's one of the ways we can deal with the federalism issues when usually federal and state elections are on the same day, but not always. So we do have these challenges. We have several bills that are currently pending in Washington. And as a result of COVID-19, these issues have become much more dominant. In addition to that, we saw in the 2016 elections, Russia's interference in our free and fair elections. What steps are we taking to protect the integrity of our election system? Before we get to your questions, I'm going to give my guests a chance to make a few opening comments, and then we'll get to questions, and we'll keep this discussion going. So, Kristen, let me start with you. First, what is the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law?
Well, thank you so much, Senator Cardin, for bringing us together for this incredibly important and timely conversation. So I lead an organization, as you know, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. We actually just marked 57 years. We were founded by President John F. Kennedy in June of 1963, who issued a call to action to lawyers to engage in the civil rights fight. We work on issues like voting rights and criminal justice, education, and fair housing. We stand on the front lines of some of the most pressing problems faced by African Americans and people of color today. And we carry out our work in partnership with the private bar, with lawyers at law firms who provide pro bono support for the work that we do. And right now, the area that kind of keeps us up at night is figuring out how we can ensure that all Americans have access to the ballot box in the wake of the pandemic and in the wake of voter suppression, and sadly, in the wake of a Justice Department that is not aggressively out enforcing the Voting Rights Act right now. So proud to be here today and to talk about ways for us to work together to ensure that everyone has voice in our democracy in 2020.
Well, thank you very much. And we're going to get into some of those discussions. Dana, the ACLU is well known. It's well known for its work in Maryland. It's known for its work around the nation. We've seen some challenging court decisions, including the Shelby County decision that weakened the Voting Rights Act. Just tell us a little bit about the priorities that the ACLU sees in protecting the integrity of our election system.
Thank you so much, Senator Cardin. And I want to give a shout out to all the Marylanders who were tuning in and ACLU members across the state. The ACLU of Maryland has been here for the past 88 years in Maryland. We're focused on making sure that the laws support and uplift the humanity of everyone across the state. We are working with communities across Maryland, across the 24 jurisdictions in our state, to make sure that the law values people, and particularly related to voting rights. We want to be sure that everyone's right to vote is protected, that voter access is encouraged, and that all Marylanders, particularly Black Marylanders, for whom the franchise has not always been available and where barriers have been in place, we want to be sure that those are addressed. We look forward to today's conversation and to participating with you and your guests.
Again, thank you for being with us. I usually get a variety of questions from the people who are participating. Uh, the majority have a common theme. So let me go to the question from Katie from Baltimore, who asks, mail-in voting is the way to go for 2020 to keep the crowd sizes down and should be a standard for future elections. We also need to set up safety measures for voters and volunteers at polling places for those who choose to vote in person. What is being done to prepare for safe and secure elections? Let me start, if I might, with Kristen. I have some views on this myself, but Kristen, we have some challenges in Maryland. There's some challenges throughout the country. What are we doing to ensure that everyone can participate in the November elections in a safe manner?
Yeah, there's a lot happening right now. There's litigation happening across the country in states that have not opened up access to absentee ballots. There's also a push in Congress to get Congress to allocate the funding that states really need to institute the full range of reforms that can ensure full and equal access to voting this season. I'll tell you, Senator, that I do think that while there is work that Maryland has to do, that there's some states that are definitely far worse. We've been monitoring elections across the country by way of our National Election Protection Program. It's the nation's largest nonpartisan voter protection program, anchored by the 866 Our Vote hotline. And the long lines that we saw in places like Milwaukee and Atlanta and New York have been heartbreaking. People have had to weather lines that stretched for hours in order to vote on election day, in places that chose to reduce dramatically the number of sites for in-person voting. I think that Maryland has done a better job than some states in implementing access to absentee ballots, but it's not been perfect. We definitely heard complaints from voters across the state who didn't get their absentee ballot, who got the wrong absentee ballot, and so had to go out and vote on election day. And we know that there are not many sites set up for in-person voting. I am hopeful that we can use some of the lessons from the primaries to really fine tune and perfect voting in November for people across Maryland. We know that we're bracing for higher turnout levels, and that now is going to be the time to really work through the breaks in the system to make sure that we're prepared for the large numbers of people that will be turning out for the general election.
So Dana, I'm in favor of making it as easy as possible for people to vote. I'm also in favor of protecting the public health of the people of our nation. We do not want large gatherings. I've been at polling places, and I can tell you they can be very crowded with a lot of activity between the candidates and between the people trying to vote and people observing the elections and the poll work and the election officials themselves. And we have a lot of places where we vote where the lines can get very long at times because you're getting near the deadline. People get in line. That's how people are. So I recognize the public health risk. I'm for making it easier. I think voting by mail is the easiest way to vote. You pick the time you want to vote. You have the security, et cetera. But from a protection point of view, there are concerns. Some people will want to vote in person. Some people will not get their ballots for whatever reason. There has to be protection in regards to being able to cast a vote. There's always the issue raised by some of fraud. So tell me how you see us responding to COVID-19, if we're going to have primarily mail-in ballots, how do we do that in protecting the civil liberties of the people of this country?
Thank you, Senator Cardin. And I appreciate also what Kristen is saying about what needs to improve in various states across the country. In Maryland, the ACLU is working with our partners across the state, voting advocates, people who are directly impacted by some of these challenges, to make sure that the State Board of Elections does a lot of work to improve its operations. Long before COVID, our election officials here had much to do a better job of making sure that everyone could participate and access. And we learned a lot in the June primary about the work that still needs to be done and some obstacles that still remain to people voting. We want to be sure that the State Board of Elections is paying attention to providing readily accessible information to people that's readily available and clear and consistent. We want to avoid human error. We want to make sure that the previous technological glitches and mistakes that the Board of Elections was responsible for are resolved, and that those who made mistakes are held accountable for them. We are a big advocate of mail-in voting. And in addition to mail-in voting, what we, and along with our partners in voting rights across the state, have been calling for and called for the June elections that we'd love to see in November is more mail-in voting, more local places where people can also have the option of dropping off their ballot, the ballot boxes where people can just drive up and drop their ballot into the boxes we did in June, and to have more of those across the state so that people have multiple ways of accessing the ballot. We know that there are several states already doing mail-in voting, have been doing it for years, have been doing it with safety and integrity, and we believe that Maryland should be doing more of that as well to keep people safe and protected. We also have asked for there to be in-person opportunities as well for people to vote, because in some cases people who are more comfortable voting in person. Also, for people with disabilities, there are challenges to voting by mail, and we want them to have every option that they can as well.
Well, you both sort of answered John's question when John asked, why can't we add more voting locations to prevent coronavirus spread? If you can go to Walmart, Costco, Giant, Safeway, etc., you can go to polls. I thought distancing and masks prevent CV spread and infection. So that raises 2 points. One, having more locations so you can have spread out the number of people, but for every location, we have to have election workers. So we are requiring frontline workers to be there for a long day. And quite frankly, it is still a risk factor. We might minimize the risk, but it's voting is indoors and there is a risk factor involved. It's a lot safer to vote by mail. So to encourage voting by mail is in our public health interest, but we do have to have enough places where individuals can go on election day safely with minimal risk if that's how they choose to vote and they do not want to vote by mail. I think we all agree on that. Let me talk about the bill that was filed in Congress, the Access Act. It requires states to have contingency plans to deal with emergencies. The pandemic surfaced in full bloom during late February, early March. States had primaries planned during that period of time. I dare say that states did not have plans in place to deal with it and had to deal with it in an emergency situation. And clearly in Maryland, when we postponed our primary, we did so, but we did not have the contingency plans on how we would do it by mail. As a result, we have problems with our vendors, et cetera. The legislation would also require no excuse absentee voting, for not just during emergencies. So individuals who, for convenience reasons or for the fact that they don't know what's going to happen on election day as far as weather or whatever else, can choose to vote by absentee ballot rather than by, it's actually voting by mail. It's not absentee. You're voting by mail with no need. In some states, you have to show that you're ill or you have to have show that you're going to be out of state in order to get an absentee ballot. This would eliminate that requirement in order to get an absentee ballot. It would require early voting at least 15 days before an election. So therefore, we spread out when people have a chance to vote. We're talking about if we don't have a pandemic and people can vote safely in person, we have found that voter participation is greatly increased because we give convenience if people can vote early. Maryland has early voting. Some states do not have early voting. This legislation would require early voting in every state, and then would require during national emergencies or an emergency in a state that the ballots be mailed out so that everyone has the ballots actually in their home. They don't have to request a ballot. Let's talk a little bit about that. And I think I'm going to start, Dana, put you on the spot here. I read the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, and powers are reserved to the states unless specifically granted to the federal government. Most elected officials are state and local elected officials. Is there a role for the federal government to play here?
We believe that, first of all, the right to vote is a right. It's not a privilege. And federal elected officials, state, county, local officials should all be focused on making sure that as many people who are eligible to vote are able to vote. So the more creative, the more thorough, the more innovative institutions and individuals can become to make sure that people can access the ballot is something that we would definitely advocate, to encourage people to not begin by here are the problems, but to remember that the right to vote is paramount, and let's make sure that everyone who is eligible can vote.
So, Kristen, you're working here in Maryland, but we have committees working in all 50 states because it's different in every state. How would you welcome a national law similar to the Access Act that would guarantee that there would be early voting, that would guarantee that you could vote by mail, that would guarantee that in the event of emergency, the ballots would be mailed out?
There is a pandemic that has upended life across our country and resulted in countless deaths. We have astronomically high confirmed cases. It's critical that we respond to the moment that we're in. So I think, Senator, that the framework set forth in that bill is precisely the prescription needed this season. We need to provide 3 avenues for the public to access the ballot this season. We need easy, unfettered access to absentee ballots and streamlining the process so people can get the application automatically, or sending the absentee ballot out to all registered voters is a way to really simplify that process, making sure that we're giving people postage paid envelopes and easing deadlines by which people have to return those ballots is critical. So that's one avenue. The second avenue is expanded options for early voting. That gives people who want and choose the right to exercise their right to vote in person are able to do so during an early voting period where it's stretched out and we won't have to deal with long lines, and we're kind of easing the burdens that officials will face on election day. So expanded early voting is key. And then third, as you know, is affording the public lots of meaningful opportunities for in-person voting on election day. One thing that we learned so far this season in 2020 is that even though there is a pandemic, there's still for many people, this sacred importance of going out and voting in person. That really matters for people, and there are people who are willing to weather the long lines, even though they shouldn't have to, in order to vote on election day. So we've got to, if we do it all right, what that means, though, is that we won't be dealing with high turnout on election day because we will have afforded the public lots of meaningful avenues to exercise their vote well in advance of election day.
So one of the related questions, a question from Flo from Catonsville, who says that Although the United States Constitution requires Postal Service, I'm very concerned that the administration will shut down the USPS in September or October, citing budgetary emergencies or other reasons, thus hindering voting by mail across the country. I can tell you, in knowing that the U.S. Postal Service, they're under tremendous financial pressure, and there have been efforts made to significantly diminish the service of the U.S. Postal Service to make it more economical. So therefore, do the easy service to make money, but not the universal, which is critically important for many reasons. I might point out that it's in the Constitution, the mail service, and it has so many more functions than just delivering ballots for elections. A lot of people get their prescription medicines by mail. A lot of people's business is absolutely dependent upon the daily mail service. Is this an area that you do believe is a risk factor? And what suggestions would you have for Congress in regards to our commitment to the U.S. Postal Service? Either one of you have a view on this?
Yeah, I do. I mean, we think about the role of election officials in getting our elections right, but this season is one where we've got to think equally hard as much about the role of the U.S. Service. They are indispensable to ensuring the success of an election season where we will see historic and unprecedented numbers of Americans casting absentee ballots. We need to ensure that they get federal funding. We need an agency that will have the resources that they need to meet the demands that they have faced in wake of the pandemic and in the wake of this unprecedented election season. And I would also encourage oversight. I am deeply concerned about some of the leadership changes that we've seen at the helm of the U.S. Postal Service while they're in the midst of, an incredibly important and dramatic moment. The number two and most senior official at the U.S. Postal Service recently stepped down, and he's somebody who's interfaced with secretaries of state across the country in many elections. I'm a little worried about the leadership vacuum and what impact that may have on the Postal Service being able to carry out its role and its duty this season. So funding and oversight, I think, are critical, Senator Cardin.
Questions?
Can't hear you.
Okay. All right. Everybody okay? I'm going to go to two questions here that will, I think, create a little bit of different views among my two guests. My two guests, Kristen Clarke, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and Dana Vickers Shelley from the American Civil Liberties Union, Maryland chapter. Dandry from Rockville asks, this is a great idea. Thank you. I guess my question is, how do we combat the spread of misinformation about mail ballots? They have already been proven to use and quite successfully. And then we have Annie, who asked the question, I'm in favor of voting by mail, and I think it's, we'll get to the political part. What is being done to ensure only registered voters vote? So, question about misinformation, the question about fraud. And let me set this up, because we have seen a growing trend in American politics where it has been fair game to try to diminish the vote of constituencies that you believe will be more favorable towards your opponent. We have seen this in laws that have been passed by states. We have seen this in direct advertising. We have seen this in misinformation that has been sent about the day of election or the time for election or the endorsements that candidates have received when they haven't received it. We've seen this over and over again occurring. Now, it's always been fair game for a candidate to try to get out as many voters as he or she can possibly do who favors them. Get out the vote as part of campaigning. That's something we cherish in American politics. but trying to diminish the vote is something that I would think should have no place in America. Just by way of example, I've joined my colleagues this week in sending a letter to the Secretary of Defense. We are concerned about our soldiers overseas being able to get their votes in on time because of COVID-19 and the mail service, and how you're going to make sure that their votes are going to be counted in November. So we're doing everything we can to make sure that every vote can get here safely and be counted. So we have that First Amendment that I cherish, the right of freedom of speech. People have the right to campaign, and ACLU has been a great defender, and I'm a great champion of the ACLU's defense of the First Amendment rights. But there is something wrong about trying to discourage people from voting. And with mail-in ballots, you could get misinformation. So people are told that if you mail your ballot in and you owe a parking ticket, we're going to be able to get you. Things like that, which is certainly very false, or that unless you have a voter ID law issued by government and you try to cast a vote, your vote's going to be fraudulent. Those types of can intimidate people from voting. What, if anything, what role, if any, does we have in order to ensure that voters understand their right to participate and are not intimidated because of tactics used in a partisan election?
If I could start with that, Senator Cardin, thank you for that question and those concerns. One of the major demands that we at the ACLU of Maryland have had and are making to our State Board of Elections is to make sure that there are contingency plans, to make sure that there's a clear explanation and clear information that's consistently delivered to all voters. One of the challenges that we saw in June was the lack of readily available and clear and consistent information from our own State Board of Elections. In Maryland, when you apply for your either absentee ballot or your mail-in ballot, you have to go online and provide your information so that the State Board of Elections knows that you are a registered voter. What we're focused on is not the distraction of the noise about, our votes, is voting safe, is there integrity? Yes, there is, and we expect for our State Board of Elections to help to increase and promote that by reaching out and talking with community leaders from diverse perspectives, from diverse parts of the state, to hear what's needed to make sure that access is provided for everyone, and to make sure that information is provided in a timely way, in an efficient way.
I appreciate that answer. I don't know, Kristen, if would you like to weigh in on this?
Yes, because this is a major threat that we face in our democracy. Disinformation campaigns that spread false information about the time and place for voting, about the qualifications for voting, about the requirements that may apply in your state for accessing absentee ballots. We see this problem perpetuated across social media platforms, and have been pushing our social media platforms to be held accountable and to do more to ensure that they are not perpetuating the spread of false information. We saw this a few months ago when we received reports of census type material that was actually put together by a political party, but could be misinterpreted as an official piece of census mailing. So it's also an issue that has impact beyond the elections context. I think that this is an area that we have to be vigilant about because of the easy ways in which misinformation spreads online. One thing that we encourage people to do is to call our election protection hotline at 866 our vote whenever they feel that they have seized on misinformation. But Senator Cardin, I also want to thank you for your leadership in this space. We're a proud supporter of the Deceptive Practices and Voter Intimidation Prevention Act, which you lead on, which would put in place penalties for people who intentionally spread misinformation. And I just can't underscore enough that this is, in our view, a really pernicious form of voter suppression, and it is a space that demands more action. So thank you for your work and leadership on putting forth a bill that could provide a solution to this problem.
Well, thank you for mentioning that. I introduced that bill starting with my first election to the United States Senate because of the experiences that I had during my election to the United States Senate. My partner in that was a young senator from Illinois by the name of Barack Obama. The two of us put the bill in together with Senator Schumer, and we have made some progress on this. But I must tell you, we all will remember the famous robocall in Maryland. And by the way, the legislation is aimed at those that target minority communities to suppress the vote with misinformation. That's the target of the bill. We saw a robocall in Maryland come out on election day to those voters who have not yet voted on election day. It purported to come from one candidate who said, "Don't worry, I have enough votes. I don't need your votes." It was coming out from the other candidate who was trying to suppress the support for his opponent. So that was prosecuted, by the way. And we do see these things come up in American politics, and they really should have no place at all. That because of the public health issues. But we have different laws in different states. I was very pleased that Maryland has an easy way for young people to register. Once you take your driver's license test, and at that time, ask you if you want to register. In American politics today, the increase in cost of elections, now corporate money coming in. With individual money, at least you know who it's from. You got the name of the person. We have disclosure laws, which is something that we think is critically important to know how a person finances their campaign. But as a result of Citizens United, you no longer have that information in a timely way. And of course, a corporation does not necessarily know who has contributed the funds for that corporation to make their contributions under Citizens United. So I just really want to get your observations. I'm very active in the U.S. Helsinki Commission, which deals with global human rights and democracy building. And I get parliamentarians who contact me frequently to want to pattern their democracy after the experiences in America. And I always put a footnote at the end and I say, well, you have to have free and fair elections, but don't pattern the way you finance your elections by the way we finance elections in America. To me, it is a system that is out of control. So I recognize the First Amendment, and there is a challenge as to whether we should amend the Constitution in order to give Congress the right to control how much money is spent. But that would be an infringement on rights. So if we don't take precautions now, the system's even going to get more out of step, making it very difficult for people without means to raise the type of money to be competitive. Uh, is this a concern? Let me start, if I might, with Dana on this. ACLU has a strong record of protecting individual rights and the freedom of speech and the right to do what in this area. But is there a common ground that we can find to improve the quality of elections, provide incentives for debate or airtime so that you can hear from candidates rather than seeing these 30-second ads? Is there a path forward consistent with our constitutional rights to improve the way we finance and the quality of elections?
I think one of the places where we can start is coming to an agreement and alignment across the fact that voting and participation in democracy is a right for all citizens, and that we encourage that rather than identify opportunities or problems or challenges that people might face. I think the more that that members of the public or leaders might dwell on here is a problem or here's an issue or a challenge to something, that diminishes people's enthusiasm about being engaged and involved in the process.
Agree. Kristen?
Yeah, I mean, this is the 10-year anniversary of the Citizens United decision, and I think that there's broad agreement that this has been devastating for democracy, that it's opened up the floodgates for, dark money in our elections. And we want elections where we have transparency. I think this has become particularly important in the wake of reports of foreign meddling in our elections. Understanding and being able to trace the source of dark money is really critical to smoking out nefarious efforts to distort and taint elections in our democracy. So I think it's an incredibly important issue, but no doubt an uphill battle with that Supreme Court precedent in place. I'm heartened by some efforts that we're seeing at the state level. New York State, for example, is a state that's put on its books a law that does require some degree of disclosure. So there may be efforts at the state level that can help to counteract some of the negative impact of the court's ruling.
Thank you. We've got a couple questions that are asking for some more specific information from the Lawyers Committee and the ACLU. Nels from Bethesda asks, has the Lawyers Committee, the ACLU, or any other group published a standard against which we can measure the fairness, safety, and quality of elections in our state? Are there any, we try to develop guidelines on best practices in human rights. We did that on trafficking in humans. We have standards that we expect countries to follow. The U.S. showed strong leadership on that. Civilized society should end modern day slavery and trafficking. We have standards that I have worked with outside groups on anti-corruption measures so that we can judge the progress that states have made in dealing with corruption. Do we have standards on free and fair elections so we can judge how well our states are doing relative to the others, and have some just general guidelines that citizens can promote for improving elections in their states?
Something that the ACLU of Maryland has done, again, in partnership with voting rights advocates across the state and community leaders, is to identify some areas where our own State Board of Elections can improve its practices and how that is done. It's a letter that we submitted to the Board of Elections, to Governor Hogan, because we believe that there are some very specific things that can change. Providing contingency plans, providing information on where and how to vote for everyone that's accessible, to making sure not just that elections officers and election judges are informed about what's going on in their various at the polling places and locations, but to make sure that elected officials also and public leaders are involved in sharing information about what is available and where people can vote, and making sure that access is available to everyone. We are very concerned that there have been in Maryland, we saw in the June primary, human error, incompetence, things that just were not helpful to making sure voters are confident in the system. And we want the Board of Elections in Maryland and the governor to take this very seriously so that everyone can participate, so that everyone is prepared for November. And we'd also like to make sure that folks who have questions about what do they need to do for it to make sure that their vote is cast, to make sure that things are safe when they go to cast their vote, by calling our election protection line, which is 443-399-3229.
Thanks for that. Kristen, I've seen you've already answered one of the questions on chat with your telephone number again, but are there standards out there that you all follow?
It's such a great question. And what I thought about was how we actually measure up to other modern democracies across the globe. And when you compare the United States to other major modern democracies, we always rank towards the bottom when it comes to voter turnout and voter participation. So to me, that's a very important metric and a reminder about the work that we've got to do to catch up to the rest of the globe. We make it so hard for people to register and vote in our country. We need reforms like same day registration in all states that can give people that opportunity when it really counts to get registered to vote. We need to think about making Election Day a holiday for so many people, getting out and voting when you've got a job without flexibility, when you've got childcare responsibilities, can be difficult. So we need to think about the unnecessary barriers and burdens that impair the ability of Americans to get out and vote. One barrier that Maryland has finally dealt with is opening up access to the ballot for people with criminal histories, a very important reform that was just put on the books. And thank you, Senator Cardin, for your leadership. The Democracy Restoration Act would seek to ensure that in federal elections across the country, that people are able to vote regardless of their criminal history. But these are the reforms that we need to really make the United States the modern democracy that we want it to be. We want this to be a place where we've got high, robust levels of turnout and participation rates, and we've got some work to do to catch up to other countries across the globe.
Well, thank you. We were pleased with the Maryland law that was passed in regards to returning citizens. There are still some states that for a relatively minor violation of a crime, you have a lifetime prohibition from participating in elections. And it is clearly discriminating against minorities. We know that the larger percentages by far, not that they commit more crimes, but the way the criminal justice system has been discriminatory, have those convictions. And they're used again to suppress the vote of minorities in states where the ruling elite believe that by suppressing that vote, they can do better. And that's the principal reason why they have not restored the voting rights. I mention that now because I think we are having a very healthy national discussion about how we deal with historic discrimination and how we can move forward. I think democracy restoration, restoring the right to vote, is one of those issues that we hope that we're going to be able to make major advancements during this time. And that telephone number again is 866 our vote for reaching the people in the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Don Owens asks on Facebook, this is a great discussion. What should we do if we choose to vote at a polling place and it doesn't open on time, like incredibly late? What do we do?
I appreciate that question, Senator Cardin, and I just wanted to add before I respond to Don's question is something that you said about the right to vote for all citizens. We know in Maryland that while Black people are 30% of the population, they are 70% of the population in our jails and in our prisons. And we are demanding that people who are eligible to vote, who are in jail, who are in prison, and eligible still to vote, that they be allowed to do so, and that voter registration forms be available, ballots be available, so that everyone can access the franchise. To Don's question, if you live in Maryland, we hope that you'll call the ACLU voter protection line at 443-399-3229. That is a way to make sure that we're informed, that we will send someone out to check and see what's happening at the polls. In previous elections, we have also heard from people in very long lines in Prince George's County or Charles County, and we call and encourage folks to remain in line. We also do our best to coordinate with folks at the Board of Elections, at the state and local election boards. But we ask, of course, that people do their best to be patient. The last time there were long lines in one of the jurisdictions, we also worked with local community folks to send pizza to voters who were in line just to encourage folks to stay there. But we want to be sure that you notify us so that we can get resources and support to that location. And as always with an election and voting, be patient, keep your cool, keep your information, and stay in line so that you can cast your vote.
And I want to thank both of my guests. They've put their contact numbers in the chat box. They've said it online. Please note those numbers where you can get help if you have a specific concern on being able to vote. And also on our chat box, we have the information from the Maryland Board of Elections as to how you can contact them, how you can get the most accurate election-related information. And they give you their contact on Facebook. So that information is on the chat box, and I would encourage you all to note that information. We cannot conclude without talking about outside influence and what we saw in 2016 with the interference of Russia in our elections. Election security is a matter of utmost importance. There's legislation pending in the Senate that would provide an additional $3.6 billion for election security. The House of Representatives have passed the HEROES Act that provides $3.6 billion for election security. We have public reported information that Russia and other countries are actively considering their options in regards to the 2020 election. We'd be naive to think that our open system of how we operate would not be used by our enemies to try to undermine our system. What can we do, and how much of a concern is it that we will see foreign actors try to interfere in our election? What should we do about it?
Well,
Go ahead, please.
no, and we continue to see the threat. We know that this remains a live threat, and it's critical. One, social media companies need to be held to account. Facebook has made clear that they will allow candidates to publish false information, which is incredibly troubling, but pretty much a green light to foreign actors who may similarly seek to abuse the platform to spread misinformation. And as a civil rights lawyer, I am deeply concerned about this issue because we know that in the past it's been done in a way to promote racial discord and racial divisiveness in our elections as well. So this is very much a voter suppression tactic that is focused on the African American community and people of color in particular. I'm deeply concerned about this issue, and I hope that the Senate will pass a bill that puts in place that additional $3.6 billion in funding that states direly need to strengthen their systems, to put in place absentee voting, early voting, and in-person voting, and to recruit poll workers, but to also strengthen their systems, their computers, and their networks to make sure that they have in place safeguards that can prevent infiltration from foreign actors, an incredible threat to democracy.
One of the protections is a paper trail. It's a precaution. You at least know that you have the paper trail to verify if someone tried to interfere with the electronic counting of your vote. In Maryland, we do have paper trail. There are still several states that do not have a paper trail, and this has been one of the issues that we've taken up in the Congress of the United States. Seems to me that's a pretty simple issue for us to deal with. Why shouldn't we have that? There's no downside to making sure that we can verify that someone has not interfered with the accurate count. Technology is advancing to such a stage that cyber attacks are routine. We know that. We know foreign actors are routinely attacking us through cyber. And our cyber defenses are great, but they're not perfect. So to me, having a paper trail it doesn't infringe upon any of our freedoms, and it guarantees that we have at least a way to verify election results. I don't know if the ACLU has a formal position on paper trail ballots or not, but it seems to me this is one area where we could have pretty clear agreement for integrity in our election system.
A paper trail is definitely important, and that can make a difference. Something that we would also call on at the ACLU of Maryland is to encourage all of our local leaders, our elected officials, our community leaders and residents who have been doing so much of this great work to make sure that accurate and clear information is shared within your communities, is shared within your districts, to make sure that regardless of what people may be accessing or observing in social media, or on television or radio where sources may not be clear, to get information out to people and share that within your own social network, within your own community, to make sure that people are getting the accurate information that they need. One of the things that we observed in advance and on the day of the June primary here in Maryland were that local county execs, local officials were reaching out to voters to make sure that people had the information they needed about where to vote, when to vote, timing. All those things are so important.
An excellent point. You know, the League of Women Voters perform a very important function for our community. They have been there as the great advocate of information, so we have informed voters. I couldn't agree with you more. One of our major responsibilities is to have a better informed electorate as to how our process works, how they can make sure their vote is counted, how they can register, and how they can protect against the misinformation that's out there. I think we all can do a better job. I just really will give you one more observation. As I said, I'm a great admirer of the ACLU. I'm a great admirer of the committee that you represent, Kristen. I participate in a lot of international meetings on democracy and human rights. And I sit in a place different than my colleagues in other democratic countries because although they protect the right of freedom of speech, it's not embedded in their constitution like it is in America. So when we talk about national security issues such as the spread of terrorism, as we talk about the spread of hate through the internet, as we talk about trafficking and solicitations through the internet, as we talk about voter fraud through the internet, they have a much more aggressive attitude on dealing with the social media platforms than we do. And they have taken much more direct action than we have. And we have had great debates as to how we can do a more aggressive programming consistent not only with the letter, but the intent of our freedom of speech in this country. And in doing that, we certainly have to have my two guests at the table as we discuss these issues so that we make sure that the cure is not worse than what we're trying to prevent. So I think this is a discussion that we really need to have. And I thank you both for that discussion. A good question from Holly. What are we doing to make sure we can get results quickly? I'm curious about what happened in New York. The election took place last Tuesday, not this Tuesday, and they still haven't counted most of the votes. What can we do about getting the results out in a more timely way? And I say that not just because of our curiosity, but I think there's suspicion the longer it goes before you know election results.
You know, this is going to be a very unusual season because of the sheer numbers of absentee ballots. In some states, voters will have up through election day to have their absentee ballot postmarked in order for it to count. There have been a few places where voters have been given time that's gone beyond that. And you know, it's an election where we want the public to know that every vote counts. So this season's going to require a little bit more patience than we ordinarily bring to bear. I do think that in a few states we won't have certified election results until a few days after the election, when the Postal Service delivers all of those absentee ballots cast by people who, because of fear of COVID or for other reasons, are participating by absentee ballot. We're going to have to wait for those ballots to come in and be counted. That said, I think that the person who raises this question is right to raise the kind of fear of how this impacts the public narrative. And my organization, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, is working with many organizations across the country right now to make sure that we are fully prepared for this November general election. We want an election that is accessible to all. We want an election outcome that the public can have confidence in. We want to make sure that the rules are fair, and we want to make sure that every vote counts. So we are on high alert this season.
Good point. Dana, you get the last word.
We need to make sure that every vote counts and that every vote is counted. We're going to have to be patient, as Kristen said, but we need to make sure that everyone has access to the ballot and that everyone's ballot and vote are counted. And we need to make sure that that happens.
Well, first, let me thank you all for joining me on Facebook Live. I particularly want to thank Kristen Clarke from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, not just for being here, but what you do every day to protect our precious democracy. And to Dana Vickers, Shelley from the ACLU, Maryland. Again, I want to thank you for your leadership and your organization's leadership, speaking out for the civil liberties of the people of our community. I just want to underscore the point I think Dana just concluded. Our objective is for every eligible person in this country who is eligible to vote to be registered and have the opportunity to cast his or her vote, and for that vote to be counted accurately. Our democracy works best when we have participation, and we need your participation in the election process. There's responsibilities by the candidates to conduct a more positive campaigns. And we need to have a system that allows voters to be better informed. And we can do more to deal with better informed voters in this country. But the bottom line is we have to guarantee that our election system is free and fair, that every eligible voter has the opportunity to express that vote. That's going to be more challenging with COVID-19. And the steps we're taking now, we hope, will make it easier for us to live up to the great commitment of this country to our democratic values. Thank you for joining me on Facebook Live. And again, thanks to our guests, Kristen Clarke and Dana Vickers Shelley. Thank you.